I want to welcome everybody to the third webinar in our horse management webinar series. This is this third webinar series we've done virtually. This program used to be live, and actually we've had so many positive responses about holding these webinars that we decided to keep it virtual this year. With that being said, we are going to ask you to fill out a survey afterward. So please do, because I want to know if these are worthwhile going forward. And if so, what topics you would like. We focus solely on nutrition this time around because the response was overwhelming last year in terms of wanting to know more about nutritional topics. So that's what we've done this year. And we've got two great speakers talking to us today, all on forage and forage related diets for horses. So with that, let me tell you briefly who I am and who the Equine Science Center is, who is helping me host this. I'm Dr. Carrie Williams. I'm the Equine Extension Specialist at Rutgers University, which means I can put on a lot of programs like this for horse owners within our industry. I also do a lot of teaching and research. I also have Kyle Hartman with me. He's kind of helping me behind the scenes with registration and with any technical difficulties. So like you might have heard me mention, if you have any problems, please go ahead and type in the chat box that you might be having problems, and he will get back to you. If you have any content related questions, we're only asking those in the Q&A box. So for those who are unsure, if you hover with your mouse over the bottom of your screen, you'll see a bunch of buttons pop up. You'll see participants and Q&A and chat and a bunch of other ones. So really the Q&A and the chat are the two that you want to focus on. And again, chat is just for questions regarding technical issues. So I also want to thank Triple Crown. Triple Crown Nutrition has been a huge supporter of my programs for pretty much as long as I've been running programs, which is going on 20 years. Kelly Payne is our regional specialist, and she has been gracious enough for every evening she's offering a door prize. And how you are eligible to enter and to win these door prizes is you have to stay on until the very end. We will randomly select a participant that is still on at the very end. And then we will pull your email from our registration list, and we will send an email to Kelly Payne. She will be emailing you with a selection of prizes because she has some prizes that are good for people that own horses and some that are good for those that might not own horses. I will say they are really, really good prizes. So it's worthwhile staying to the end, even if you're not interested in the material, which I don't know why you would be here because it's really good today. And I'm very excited. So let me just give you a little brief overview of what the Equine Science Center is. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen quickly. I'm going to remember to optimize everything today. So again, welcome. I'm going to play a little video from the Equine Science Center. So I would just like everybody to go ahead and pay attention to this video for about 2 minutes.
Good morning. Welcome to the George H. Cook campus, home of the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station, the School of Environmental Biological Sciences, and of course, home to the Rutgers Equine Science Center. The Equine Science Center is a soft-walled center where we bring together the best and the brightest to solve challenges impacting horses, horse well-being, and the horse industry. To provide you more details about the research being conducted at the Equine Science Center, and specifically the Equine Exercise Physiology Lab, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kenneth McKeever.
The lab was founded in 1995, and since then it's been one of the most productive research labs in the country, if not the world. We've conducted studies looking at how to care for the aged horse. That's a horse that's over 20. We've looked at various drugs that affect performance. We've even done studies for the Army looking at food extracts that can reduce inflammation. So the Equine Science Center and the Equine Exercise Physiology Lab are a valuable asset to how we care for horses in the state of New Jersey.
So we've all visited this morning the Equine Exercise Physiology Lab, part of the Equine Science Center at Rutgers. We have another facility where cutting-edge research is being carried out, located on Riders Lane, and it is the site of the first of its kind environmental best management practices demonstration horse farm. located here on the George H. Cook campus. The team of scientists who are helping horse farmers become better environmental stewards and caretakers of the land is a team of multidisciplinary faculty, students, and staff led by Dr. Carrie Williams, Dr. Mike Westendorf, PhD student Jennifer Weinart, and other faculty, students, and staff from different departments here at Rutgers and beyond.
Hello, I'm Dr. Carrie Williams, the Equine Extension Specialist here at Rutgers University and the Associate Director of Extension for the Equine Science Center. We are here at the Environmental Best Management Practice Demonstration Horse Farm. This serves as a wonderful venue for the public, farm owners, other industry professionals to come look and see the 8 various best management practices, educational venues that they can use on their farm or in their areas. It is open to the public. You can come anytime. This venue also serves as a great location for research. My current graduate student, Jennifer Weinart, is looking at both cool season and some novel warm season grasses to see the production as well as the horse's metabolism. Some glucose and insulin responses as well as the microbiome will be looked at over the next 2 years of this project. Thank you for visiting all of us at the Equine Science Center. Our website can be found at esc.rutgers.edu.
So hopefully that explains all of what the Equine Science Center is. I would just invite anyone, because these webinars are free, and granted, they don't cost anything to put on, but there is a lot of time and effort involved, especially behind the scenes to get everything organized. So if you are interested in supporting what we do and our mission at the center, we just encourage you to go to our website, which is shown on the screen, and consider donating some money to our programs. And again, really any amount of money is graciously accepted and really will help us continue our mission. So with that being said, now that we all have seen who we are, I really want to know who you are. So we're going to do a quick little survey before I introduce our first speaker. So wherever you are, if you're on a computer or laptop, you might want to go to your phone, or if you're on your phone, you might want to open up another window. But I ask everybody to go to menti.com, and that's MENTI.com. Kyle will also put in some numbers into the chat so that everybody can follow along with me, because I'm going to ask you just a few questions here. I'm also going to go ahead and share my screen again so that we can see. There we go. So if you're in menti.com now, and I see everybody starting, you'll enter the numbers 378-692, and Kyle has populated that into the chat. So now I want to know, what state or country are you listening from? And if you don't abbreviate, if you write out the whole word, what it's going to do is combine answers. So the more that answer from a particular state or country, the larger the word is going to get. So right now I see that Pennsylvania and New Jersey and even Canada and Maryland are kind of fighting for the top spot. Pennsylvania and New Jersey are back and forth. And if I was a really good race caller, I could do that, but I'm not. But I just think it's fascinating watching the words turn as we get more and more people logged on. So right now we're up to 65, 66, 68, and the numbers are climbing. So I'm going to let this change for a little bit. My goal one of these years is to reach all 50 states. I think one year we were at 39, and that's the highest I've seen so far. So that's wonderful. But again, try not to abbreviate your state as you're typing these in. Write out the whole word, and it'll combine more of the answers. So let's see if I can, while it's all moving, see if I can see any of our international folks, because I know we have some that have said hi to us. We've got Saskatchewan, welcome. I know there was a bunch from Canada, which is great. We had our first speaker in Canada. I see Brazil flashing around. That's awesome. I think I also saw Spain. Yes, I even see Spain. We've got 120 people on the Menti right now. So this is fantastic. Thank you so much. But we have New Jersey still being the largest, along with Maryland and Pennsylvania right behind it. And I know for sure that our speakers helped recruit you guys in Maryland, because we've got both of our speakers from Maryland today. So while that still changes and you can still log on and do this, I'm going to go to our next slide, and you can still answer these previous slides, but I'm going to go to the next one, because now I want to know, what is your primary interaction with horses? So I allow two answers here. So if you own a horse, but you're also a horse trainer, you can go ahead and select both. Or if you own horses and are also a veterinarian, etc. So you can mention on here. If you are other, what I would love to know is what other. So if you want to go ahead and type in the chat box what other occupation you are, that would be great, because then I can read some off. Because I know in the past we've had things like, oh, yep, and I just see student pop up. We've got a PATH, certified instructor, which is therapeutic and handicap riding. So great. Yeah, a lot of PATH. We also have the body worker. And a couple people want the code again. So yeah, our code is 37806972. So awesome. We've got nutritionists, a licensed vet tech, body workers. So we've got a lot of fun other stuff, but it looks like quite a few of you, if not most of everybody, at least owns horses. And then we've got kind of an equal number of horse enthusiasts, trainers, barn managers, and some other. So that is fantastic. And we have about 125 people that logged on to Menti, which we have even more participants as well. So thank you all for joining on. What I usually do with these is I take, after it's all said and done, I take a snapshot, or I take a screenshot of the little graphic here, and I use that in a lot of my reporting or end of the year reporting to show the impact that these webinars have, both around across the country and globally, and also to show what the demographics are. So thank you again for doing this. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Again, this is still live, even though I'm not sharing, so you can still go ahead and fill out the Menti as we start our webinars. So with that being said, I'm going to take a breath, and I'm going to read the bio of our first speaker. I'm going to ask Dr. Grev to go ahead and take off or put on her camera and go ahead and pull up her slides. I am happy to welcome Dr. Amanda Grev. She is a Minnesota native. She received her master's and her PhD in animal science at the University of Maryland, where her research focused on equine nutrition and forages and pasture management. In 2019, Dr. Grev joined the University of Maryland Extension team as their forage extension specialist. In this role, she works to support equine owners and managers by providing pasture and forage-related education, programming, and other resources. She moved to the East Coast with her horse, Ratata, and is happy to combine her passion for horses and science in a job where she can help people improve their pastures and make better forage decisions. So welcome, Dr. Grev. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and mute and let you take it away.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Dr. Williams, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone who's joined us. It's really great to see such a great crowd of people. As she said, in my current role, I'm the forage extension specialist for Maryland. So I now get to work not only with horses, but also with other livestock species as well. But horses are kind of my background, and I have a horse myself. So it's exciting to be kind of back with the equine crowd for certain events. So tonight we're going to talk for my portion of things about alfalfa, and kind of a whole overview of some of the pros, some of the cons, some of the nutritional considerations for alfalfa, to try to help you narrow down and decide when alfalfa might be the right choice or might not be the right choice for your horse or for the horses that you're working with. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started and say, first of all, what is alfalfa? If most people in the horse industry are probably familiar with alfalfa and have seen it or heard of it before. But for those who might not be familiar, alfalfa is a type of forage. It can be fed to horses both as pasture or as dried hay. We see it, commonly as a hay product, but we'll talk a little bit about alfalfa in a pasture situation as well in a little bit. It is a legume, so we'll talk about what that means here in a second. It is also a perennial species. So we have perennial species that last for multiple years. We have annual forages that are just kind of on an annual 1-year basis, similar to, plants that you may put in your flower beds or your gardens. We have annual and perennial forage species, and it is a cool season forage. So we'll talk in a sec what that means. Basically, because alfalfa is a cool season forage, it thrives naturally in cooler and wetter climates at more of a moderate temperature. So you can think of this as following our typical cool season grass growth curve, where we see a lot of forage growth in the spring months as things start to warm up for the year, and then we see a summer slump period kind of in the heat of that summer, and then we see an additional spurt of growth in the fall as temperatures cool off again. One fun fact about alfalfa, though, even though it is a cool season, compared to a lot of our cool season grasses, it does actually have slightly better summer production. So it is able to tolerate the summer heat a little bit better than some of our cool season grasses. So we may see maybe more like this sort of a curve in the summer months as well. So that can be one potential advantage. On the perennial and the legume side, we said it's a perennial, so it's long-lived, very productive throughout many years of a lifespan. We'll talk in a sec in more detail about the nutrient content of alfalfa and how that kind of compares to grasses. But here's your sneak peek, if you will. We know that most legume species, alfalfa included, are very palatable to livestock, and horses especially like alfalfa for the most part. We know that alfalfa as a legume forage contains a relatively deep taproot, which is part of the reason that it has that high summer productivity. It's able to reach down deep in the soil profile and pull up nutrients and water from deeper down in the soil profile. And as a legume, it also has the advantage that it's capable of fixing nitrogen. So legume species, most of them have the ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and use that as a form of nutrients for the plants. So that's just a little bit of kind of the background behind alfalfa and what it is. Alfalfa also contains, from a nutritional standpoint, all of the 6 essential nutrients, right? So just like we as humans have these essential nutrients: water, carbohydrates, protein, fat, vitamins, and minerals, forages like alfalfa contain at least a little bit of all of these essential nutrients as well. And we can further break the carbohydrates portion down, especially when we're talking about livestock, ruminants, and hindgut fermenters like horses, into more of the structural component or the fibrous component, as well as the non-structural component, which is that kind of readily available, easily digestible portion of the carbohydrates. And if we think about what of all of this provides energy, we get energy from a combination of things. So we get energy from carbohydrates, both structural and non-structural. We get energy from protein, and we get energy from fat, to a little bit of from fat. So all of these all together kind of represent our forage nutritive value. And just like all of our other forages, alfalfa does contain some of all of these. So we're going to kind of look a little bit at how the nutrients in these different categories for alfalfa compare to maybe some of the cool season grasses or warm season grasses that we might be used to seeing a little bit more frequently. So for this table, I have kind of row by row some different nutrients. You can see here, this first one is digestible energy. So kind of a measure getting at that energy source, or that energy component of the forage. The columns, CSG is cool season grasses, WSG is warm season grasses, and then of course alfalfa or legumes over there on the far right side. So when we think about energy and the energy content of something like alfalfa compared to our grass species, we usually think of alfalfa as being more nutrient dense or more calorie dense, containing a higher amount of energy compared to some of our grass forage species. And you can see those numbers reflected here. I should also say a quick disclaimer that all the numbers you're going to see in this chart are kind of averages. So it's not a hard and fast rule. There's a lot of factors that go into forage quality and nutritional value. So, you may see an alfalfa sample slightly above or below this range, but I tried to pull out some some kind of average ranges for us to consider as we kind of look at these different nutrients. So alfalfa, usually higher in energy compared to many of our grasses. I thought while I was going through these, I would also do a couple of disclaimers or, myth busters, if you will, because I think there's a lot of myths surrounding alfalfa in particular out there in the industry. So our first myth, if you will, or myth buster is true or false, alfalfa makes horses more hyper. And I just thought if people would quick type in the chat, quick true or quick false. I know you guys can't see the chat answers, but I can see them, and I'll kind of just relay that information for you to you all. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of falses coming in. I don't even see any trues thus far. So yes, you guys are correct that this is a common myth surrounding alfalfa. So this would be false. Alfalfa does contain a higher energy component, like we're seeing here, but there really is not a lot of data to suggest that there's really a behavioral response to this, and a behavioral response in terms of alfalfa in particular making horses more hyper. So good job on that one, everyone. Maybe that myth has kind of been busted over the years. So next we thought we'd look at crude protein. So crude protein, here again for our different forages, we see that alfalfa on average contains a higher amount of crude protein compared to our different grass species. And so alfalfa is kind of known for this, right? A high energy component, a high protein component. And so here's your next one. True or false, if you want to hit the chat again, alfalfa causes kidney problems due to its high protein content. What do we think on that one? All right, I see a lot of falses, a lot of no's coming in, maybe one or two trues. This one is also false, right? So for the most part, we know that a normal healthy horse is able to metabolize and excrete any extra protein that they get in the ration just fine, as long as they have adequate access to water. The caveat with that is any horse obviously who has kidney disease might be more susceptible to this, but that is not very common for most of our equine crowd. So again, this is another one that sometimes you see this rumor getting circulated, but it's not usually true. All right, so next is moving into more of our fiber components. When we compare NDF, or kind of the total fiber value of a ration for alfalfa compared to our grass species, we see that alfalfa is usually lower compared to grasses in terms of total fiber content. So neutral detergent fiber, or NDF, total fiber, is usually decreased for alfalfa. And similarly, when we look at ADF, or acid detergent fiber, kind of a sub-fraction of that fiber component, representing more of the indigestible fiber, again, we see a reduction usually in alfalfa compared to grasses. Some essential minerals like calcium are usually higher in alfalfa compared to our warm season or cool season grass species. So calcium is one in particular that's known to be higher in legumes like alfalfa. And phosphorus is usually fairly similar or comparable between the different ones. But because alfalfa has that higher calcium percentage, we usually see a greater calcium to phosphorus ratio, which we know for horses, we want to be keeping that ratio above 2 to 1 for calcium to phosphorus. So this is sometimes easier to do when we have a legume included in the mix because of that higher calcium component. NSC, or non-structural carbohydrates, is always a big one for horses, right? Especially for those that are sensitive to it. And we actually see that both alfalfa and warm season grasses tend to be lower in non-structural carbohydrates compared to our cool season grasses. So usually we see alfalfa kind of equal to or lower than our cool season grasses in terms of non-structural carbohydrates. I'll show why that is in just a second. But here's your next myth buster. True or false, alfalfa is too high in sugar or non-structural carbohydrates to be safely fed to horses. All right, again, I see a lot of false coming in. I maybe gave that one away a little bit by showing you the number ahead of time. But yes, this is another one that's false. So alfalfa really actually contains a little bit less, usually, non-structural carbohydrate compared to many of our cool season grasses. And then finally, if we look at relative forage quality, or kind of an overall measure of total forage quality, we see that alfalfa tends to be on the higher end, which is expected. Of course, we said it has higher energy, higher protein, so it kind of has that higher total forage quality overall. So if we kind of roughly lump these into categories, we can think of alfalfa as kind of our highest quality forage source, our cool season grasses kind of as our next, and then warm season grasses are usually more kind of on the moderate end of that spectrum. You see the asterisk down there. The caveat with this is there are a lot of different factors affecting forage maturity. So this is all kind of if all other things are considered equal, if these different types of forages are at the same maturity, same management style, etc. That's kind of the categories that we like to see. So I mentioned non-structural carbohydrates. Remember, this is all simple carbohydrates. So sugars, fructans, starch, all included in that value. And we talk a lot about cool season versus warm season forages in terms of when they grow during the year and the fact that warm seasons are more tolerant during the summer months and they can grow during the heat of the summer compared to cool season forages. But there's actually biological differences in why that is, and we're not going to go into that, but just know that there's differences in the biology of the plant cells for cool season and warm season forages. And for our cool season forages, they accumulate both sugars and fructans as part of their carbohydrate reserves, whereas warm season forages use starch as their main carbohydrate reserve and do not produce fructans. So this is why oftentimes the non-structural carbohydrate content is a little bit lower in a warm season forage compared to a cool season forage. And in this case, even though alfalfa is considered a cool season, it actually acts more like a warm season. So like some of those warm season forages, it usually does not accumulate fructans, which is why, again, we usually see that slightly lower warms or total non-structural carbohydrate content for our alfalfa forages. So just a fun fact for those who are, more interested in the non-structural carbohydrate component specifically. All right, so this is kind of taking the table that we just looked at and kind of translating it into maybe more of a visual or graphical representation. So here we have relative forage quality, or RFQ, kind of that overall measure of total forage quality. And it increases, as you can see, as it goes from left to right. And then along the left side, we see all of these different types of forages broken up kind of by different categories. And again, if we look at a comparison between some of our grasses, so here, fescue orchard grass, some of our cool season perennial grasses, compared to some of our warm season grasses like Bermuda grass, the hay grass, compared to alfalfa or other legumes, we see that even though there's a wide range, alfalfa and some of our other legumes tend to be on the higher end of the spectrum when it comes to kind of that overall quality. So they average a little bit higher forage quality overall. But the cool thing about these graphs is that you can see not only the averages, but also these wide ranges in quality, right? So the colored bars for each of these represent kind of a standard range in samples that were submitted to the forage lab. So you can see for alfalfa and some of these other categories, we really see a wide range in quality. And why is that? Well, just like all of our other forages, we know that our nutrient content or our quality varies a lot based on a lot of different factors. We don't have time to go through all these, but this is just a list of some of the major factors that can influence forage quality. So keep in mind that alfalfa does not equal alfalfa, does not equal alfalfa, right? So there's a range in quality even within a specific species like alfalfa. So just keep that in mind as we're going through. The reason we need to keep that in mind is when we go to assess forage quality and say we want to compare an alfalfa sample compared to a grass sample, there's a couple different ways we can evaluate forage quality. So we can look at it visually, right? And we can see, what the maturity is, maybe get an indication of what some of the different species in that forage sample are, especially if it's a, fresh pasture, we can get an idea of what's growing in that field. We can look at kind of the leafiness or the stemminess of those samples. But on the flip side of the spectrum is an actual forage test or a forage analysis, right? So we've gone out, we've collected a sample, we've sent that sample to the lab, and we get an actual report on the forage nutritive value. And this is key because this forage test or this forage analysis is really the only thing that's going to tell us the exact forage nutrients in our sample. So we can tell some things visually and we can get maybe rough ideas, especially if there's, large differences between samples, but we're never going to know the actual nutrient content. We're never going to really be able to tell the nutrients present in a forage. So just to drive that point home, our forage nutritive value, or our forage, the nutrients present in a forage, cannot be determined from just looking at it, feeling it, smelling it, and seeing how it looks. The forage nutritive value really can only be evaluated with a forage analysis. And for those who don't believe me, or who think, there's a lot of experts out there that are really good at judging hays and looking at hays and determining the forage quality, that is true, but it's always a guess. So this is just a fun little experiment that they did at one of the national forage meetings, where there was extension people and researchers and industry personnel and producers all together in a meeting. And they had these 4 hay samples. I'll just label them A, B, C, and D here. And what you see in these bars is the actual quality of each of those samples. So D was the highest quality, A was the lowest quality. And they had everybody guess which of those samples was best to worst. So they had everybody rank them. And actually 45% of people at the meeting thought that hay A was the best, even though it was the worst. 3% of people thought B was the best. 32% of people thought C was the best, and only 20% of people actually got it right that hay D was the best. So just to drive that point home, that really we need to be having that forage analysis, so we really actually know what the nutrients present in our forages are. So this is just an example of a forage analysis. I don't expect you to read it. We're not going to have time to go through it all, but just wanted to kind of throw that up there. Only to say that I like to think of these forage analysis as kind of like our nutrition facts label. So when we submit a sample to the lab, they can test for all these different nutrients, and we get basically the equivalent of what the nutrition facts labels we see on foods in the grocery store. So that's kind of how I like to think of the forage analysis, as really knowing the nutritional facts of that forage. So real quick in the chat, if I was to ask you all, if you wanted to buy one of these 2 hay samples, you see there's one stack on the left, one stack on the right. Real quick, enter in if you would prefer the one on the left or the one on the right. I'm seeing a few answers for the right, 1 or 2 for the left, but most people are consistently saying that they prefer the one on the right. So this is what we'd expect, right? Obviously, we like to think of really good quality, high quality hay as being like nice and green and being really good quality. But here's where the forage analysis is important. If we take these 2 samples, and this was really actually done, they did an analysis on these 2 different stacks of hay. And when we look at the forage quality analysis, they're actually very, very similar, almost identical in quality. So just remember, the forage analysis is really what's going to tell us the nutrients present in that hay. Don't get too hung up on color or other things visually that we can see, because sometimes that can be misleading. So just a quick fun example of that. And then the last thing before we get back to alfalfa in particular is for hay cutting. So this is another kind of misconception that I see a lot in the forage industry and in the livestock industry. So for those who aren't very familiar with the term, a cutting or hay cutting is the number associated with what time a given hay field was cut. So first cutting was the first time that hay was cut for the year. So here, if we have our growth curve here, if you will, our cool season growth curve, maybe first cut, is taken sometime in the spring. We have a second cutting taken later after that hay has regrown. So it's the second time it was harvested. Third cutting is the third time it was harvested, et cetera, et cetera. We can have more than 3 cuts, especially if we are further south and we have a longer growing season. But you get the idea with that. So true or false, first cutting hay is lower in quality. Go ahead and answer that one if you don't mind. All right, I'm seeing a lot of falses, a few trues, kind of a little bit of a mix, but mostly false coming in. So yeah, so this is definitely something that is oftentimes perceived in the forage world. But first cutting hay is not necessarily lower in quality. It depends all on the forage maturity and all the steps that went into that haymaking process, how the hay was handled, how it was stored, the weather conditions, forage maturity especially, all of those things. So just really wanted to mention that because all different cuts can be good quality and all different cuts can also be really bad quality. So it's not necessarily that, you know, a certain cut or a certain color of hay is better or worse. We really want to be kind of looking at that forage analysis and factoring that in. All right, so we talked a lot about alfalfa. We've kind of done, you know, a big overview of some things to consider when we're like looking at hay, the importance of a forage analysis. So how can we decide if alfalfa is the right fit or when we should be using it? So this all comes down to a nutrient balance, right? And what I mean by that is we want an even balance of a nutrient consumed by our animal compared to the amount of that nutrient that's required by the animal. So if we think of calories, we can think of amount of calories going in balanced with amount of calories going out, right? So we know that we want to kind of have this balance. And so in order to be able to balance that, we need to know what our forage contains. So the importance of that forage analysis, but we also need to know what the individual animal requires. And this is of course going to vary a lot depending on different animals and different conditions. So again, this is just a list of some of the things that can affect nutrient requirements for our horses. So things like body condition, age, breed, level of production, activity level, the environment, the body weight, all of those things will affect how much of a given nutrient or how many calories our animals need to thrive. So I like to think about it as kind of a spectrum. So again, here we have that relative forage quality, that kind of total forage quality going along the bottom. So as we move from left to right, we see an increase in relative forage quality. And this one has these different categories of animals broken up by roughly what relative forage quality they would require. So on the far left side, where we need a lot lower overall quality, we have things like an idle horse, a horse at maintenance, you know, a horse that's not actively doing any work at the moment, though they are going to have the lowest nutritional requirement. As we move up the spectrum, we may see things like a broodmare who's pregnant but has not foaled yet. We may see a working horse who's maybe in more of a low or a moderate level of work. And they obviously have a higher requirement than a horse at maintenance, but they're still kind of on the like middle of the spectrum. And then as we continue to move up, we get up to things like a mare who's nursing, especially right in the beginning of the lactation curve. We see those really hardworking horses. Those are going to be the categories of animals that have the highest quality requirement in terms of their dietary needs. So think about this spectrum and where your horse or the horses that you're working with falls on this. And then we factor in kind of what forages we have too. So this is just that same chart that you already saw. Just as a reminder for alfalfa, it's higher in energy, so more calories usually. It's high in protein. It's lower in kind of that total fiber component. And overall, kind of, we can think of it as our highest quality category of forages. So keep that in mind. So what horses, so now it's about matching which horses from these different categories fit with this kind of nutritional profile for alfalfa. So we know that alfalfa can be the right choice for when we want to be providing more of a high quality, more of a calorie dense forage. So here, just as an example to kind of put some numbers to it, on the left side, we see kind of an average grass hay. On the right side, we see kind of an average alfalfa hay. On the, if I just pull some average numbers from that table, the grass hay on the left, we can say is 0.8 megacalories per pound. So that's the digestible energy value. And if we feed that at 1.5% body weight, this calculation was done for an 1,100 pound horse. So you can adjust accordingly if your horse weighs differently. But that 1,100 pound horse would require 13.2 megacalories per day. If we compare that, or would be, I'm sorry, not requires, would be eating or consuming 13.2 megacalories per day. On the right-hand side, alfalfa hay, we said, is more energy dense, right? So we have up to 1.1 megacalories per pound. If we feed that same horse at that same rate, they're consuming a 18.15 megacalories per day. So you can see the increase, right? So we haven't upped the amount that they're consuming. We haven't changed anything but switching from a grass hay to an alfalfa hay. And by doing so, we're upping our total calories or our total digestible energy intake from 13 to 18, which is basically 27% increase in energy, or in kind of that energy that they're consuming. So you can see how we can kind of swap these in and out from each other. So what this allows us to do is basically feed the same amount of hay that we were already feeding, but increase the total calories that that horse is consuming overall. So what types of horses might this be the right choice for? Well, we said that these are probably going to be the right choice for horses that have high nutritional needs, right? So performance horses that are in really demanding work. We know for performance horses, there's a whole spectrum from on the low end, more of a light work, moving up to moderate, moving up to heavy, or, moving up to really heavy, really hardworking horses that need those high nutritional requirements. So when we get up to the far right of that, when we get up to kind of the right half of that spectrum, those horses that are in either heavy work or very heavy work might not be able to maintain their weight as easily on just a grass forage or grass hay. So something like an alfalfa can provide a much more calorie dense forage source for these types of horses that have that high nutrient requirement. We also said that lactating mares are another category where horses have a really high nutritional requirement, right? So we know that lactation is one of the times of peak energy demand in a horse's life cycle. And so here we have, again, kind of moving from left to right, going across lactation. So like foaling would be on the far left. And as we move across, we're kind of moving through early, mid, late lactation. And then after weaning is kind of that dry period. So here in the red is that milk production or that lactation production curve. And we see that horses hit kind of that peak energy demand, usually in like the first maybe month or so. And that energy demand is really high. For horses that are in this kind of really high energy demand, it can be hard for them to consume enough forage in particular, but sometimes even with concentrates, enough energy to kind of meet those requirements. So again, alfalfa can be more of a calorie dense forage source for horses that have this kind of high energy demand. Another category would be like a young growing horse. So these horses are young, they're growing, they have a high level of nutrition that's required to be able to add on body mass. Of course, this depends a little bit on the time of growth and what growth stage they're at. And I say this because if we look at a growth curve for really any livestock species, we know that, so this is as horses or livestock increase in body weight. So as we move from left to right, they're getting older, they're putting on more body weight. So on the other axis up here, we have the percentage of that weight that's going to these different categories. So on the far left, we have a high percentage of that body weight going to muscle and bone, and a much lower percentage going to fat. And as we move further across the scale, you see that the fat component becomes a lot wider, becomes a lot bigger. So as those horses are growing and maturing, we see much less of the total weight going to muscle and bone growth, and more of that total weight gain going to the fat growth, or other types of growth. So when horses are in this, especially this earlier scale where they're really kind of putting on body weight, and a lot of that is going to be muscle and skeletal structure, and putting down bone, and they need a lot of protein, they need a lot of energy to be able to do that. So alfalfa can be an option that can contain more energy and more protein compared to some of our grass forages, and maybe can help meet the requirements of those really actively growing horses. Another category for alfalfa being the right choice might be things like hard keepers. So this could be, just your regular old mature horse, or even a young horse that's just has a very thrifty metabolism, and they, seems like they can eat everything and they just don't put on any weight, but they have a harder time maintaining their body weight or their body condition score. It could also be an older horse, like a senior horse. So this is kind of the stage my horse is actually getting to, where he's an older horse. He's always been kind of a fairly easy keeper his whole life, but as he gets older, he's having a harder time maintaining his weight and his body condition. So for these hard keepers, there is of course a limit to how much concentrate we can feed those horses. But if we think back to kind of how the GI tract of the horse was set up, we know that it was developed to consume a large quantity of forages, right? That's how they were designed. And that's how they were built, is to consume small, frequent forage meals throughout the day. So in addition to concentrate for these hard keepers or these senior horses, we might be able to also provide more calories through the forage by switching to more of an energy dense forage. Something like alfalfa that does contain those higher energy requirement or higher energy nutrients can be maybe an option for some of these harder keepers. So those are kind of all the categories that more focus on needing alfalfa as kind of a high nutritional plane. There are just two other things I wanted to mention for considerations for alfalfa that have less to do with kind of the total energy content or the amount of nutrition in a forage, and maybe more for other reasons. So this one here, inappetent horses, so horses that basically kind of lost their desire to eat or aren't eating. This obviously happens for a variety of different reasons, but assuming that, you know, the GI tract is functional, any underlying causes has been addressed, so there's no disease, there's no other things going on that we need to remedy. Assuming all of that has been addressed and fixed, it's really important to kind of get those horses eating so we can have that regular GI tract function, and we can kind of get things moving through the GI tract, get some calories in them, hopefully get them started on the route to feeling better. For some of these horses, if they're just really not feeling good, they might be kind of off their feed or not wanting to eat. So alfalfa is something that we said, remember, is usually very palatable. So oftentimes we have very few horses that actually refuse a really good quality alfalfa hay. So offering a little bit of alfalfa to some of these horses can be a good way to kind of encourage some more intake, especially voluntary intake, and kind of get them to eat this high quality forage source and hopefully kind of start them kind of being on the mend a little bit. The other one that I just wanted to mention briefly, I'm not going to get into ulcers, of course. I think that was covered actually a couple weeks ago. But when we think about ulcer-prone horses, we know that oftentimes ulcers are found in more of the non-glandular region, or kind of that top portion of the stomach, and where there's less of a protective lining on the stomach, and we oftentimes see maybe some acidity from the stomach kind of splashing up from the lower portion onto this non-glandular region, especially when horses are in heavy work or when they're working hard, or if they haven't eaten any forages or haven't chewed in a while, so there's no saliva going down to help buffer that. So if we see a prevalence of ulcers, we know that alfalfa does contain higher amounts of calcium. So remember, we mentioned that compared to grass forages, alfalfa usually contains a little bit more calcium. And this can be one way that we can help try to buffer some of that acidity going on in the stomach. So there are people who are interested in feeding just a small amount of alfalfa, maybe a couple of hours before an exercise or a workout, to help buffer, kind of create a forage mat in the stomach, help buffer some of that stomach acidity by providing that extra calcium and that extra forage to kind of help prevent some of that acidity from splashing up onto the non-glandular region. So just another option, or a small place where alfalfa might have a little bit of a role. Some people use hay. Some people I've also seen use things like alfalfa pellets or hay cubes or other things like that too. All right, so those are kind of all different situations when alfalfa might be considered more of the right choice. What about more of the wrong choice? So when we think of alfalfa as maybe a wrong choice, that's when we kind of think back to that nutrient balance or that scale that we saw at the beginning, and maybe we're getting it a little off balance. Maybe we're having a few more calories going in and not as many calories going out. So under these types of situations, our inputs, or those calories going in, are heavier than our outputs. So that's where we start to see more weight gain, more problems with overweight horses or higher body condition scores. And they're basically consuming more calories than they're expending, which is leading to kind of that overall weight gain or that increase in body condition. So for these horses, remember, alfalfa has a higher energy, is a more calorie dense forage. So for these horses, we want to do the opposite, right? We want to go from the alfalfa, away from the alfalfa. We want to go more towards that more mature grass hay. So we want to be providing these types of horses more of a lower quality, less calorie dense forage. This is the same example that you saw earlier with the grass hay on the left and the alfalfa hay on the right. And in this case, it's reversed, right? So when we're going from alfalfa to the grass hay, we're decreasing the amount of energy that those horses are consuming. And we can feed them the same amount of hay, but decrease the overall amount of calories that they're consuming within that hay. So what types of horses might this be more of a situation for? So obviously easy keepers or overweight horses, any horses where it's really easy to maintain their body weight and or they're very prone to becoming overweight. It's really easy for them to kind of put on excess body condition. You know, most of us are familiar with kind of the term easy keepers. Sometimes we like to call them metabolically thrifty. They're really good at digesting and getting calories from their food. So they're very easily becoming overweight. And so these horses are ones that I would definitely stay away from alfalfa hay. They're going to be better off with more of a low quality grass hay. This is going to allow you to have fewer calories per mouthful, so that less energy dense forage. And this basically allows you to still feed them, you know, a similar amount of hay or enough forage while kind of keeping them eating, keeping them chewing, maintaining that, you know, saliva production and kind of keeping those forages moving through the GI tract. So we have kind of that healthy GI function. In the same category could be just a horse at maintenance. So, you know, maybe they're not necessarily overweight or, you know, an easy keeper, but if they're just at maintenance, they're, you know, not in any work at the moment. Maybe they're recovering from an injury. Maybe it's a stallion in the off season, so they're not doing any breeding at the moment. But either way, again, these horses are easier to maintain that body weight in their condition. And they're usually better off with more of a lower quality grass hay or maybe a moderate quality grass hay. Again, so they have that less calories per mouthful. They can continue to eat, continue to chew, continue to have that normal GI function, but be providing that in a less energy dense forage. Performance horses. So yes, I said that performance horses might be when alfalfa is the right choice, but it also might be when alfalfa is the wrong choice, right? It can go either way. The caveat here is it depends on the body condition of that horse and the nutrient requirements of that horse. So performance horses that don't have as high of a nutritional requirement and that do have adequate body condition and are able to maintain that body condition can maintain their weight just as well on a good quality grass forage and don't necessarily need that alfalfa. So this would be, if we look at that same spectrum, this would be on the left side of it or the lower end of that. Horses that are in light work, horses that are in more moderate work, horses that have that metabolism that allows them to maintain their condition on more of a grass forage. They don't need that alfalfa forage. And at that point, it's not really worth, you know, feeding them that for your money as well. You know, alfalfa can be more expensive to feed. So they'd be better off just getting kind of a good quality grass forage. And then the other one is young horses that may be prone to growth problems. So I mentioned that young horses can have a higher energy requirement or higher nutrient requirements, but a surplus of energy or too much energy can lead to some growth problems for some horses and increase the risk of things like DOD, developmental orthopedic disease, or other problems associated with basically growing too fast or too quickly. So with these horses, you kind of have to watch them and keep an eye on them. Again, it's kind of maybe more of a case-by-case situation. If they need that extra energy, if they need those nutrients, then alfalfa can be the right choice. But for younger horses that have enough, that can get enough nutrition from their grass hay, they might not necessarily need that alfalfa, and they might be better off with either a good quality grass or maybe a mixed grass legume hay. So we're not getting them too far into a surplus of energy and creating some of those issues. So to kind of summarize all of that of when to consider alfalfa, so this would be most of the time horses that have a higher nutrient requirement. So our hardworking performance horses, our lactating mares, our young growing horses, our hard keepers, maybe our senior horses, any horses where we're kind of looking to increase intake or palatability, or sometimes a little bit with ulcer prone horses. So kind of getting them a little bit of that extra gastric buffering going on with the extra calcium. On the other end of the spectrum, a grass hay or grass forage is oftentimes more suitable for our easy keepers or overweight horses, horses that are just at maintenance, performance horses that are more on the light to moderate workload and that have adequate body condition, and then any of our young horses that are maybe more susceptible to some of those growth problems. So there's always a spectrum, right? But that's kind of, if we have to break it up into some rough categories, when I would consider or wouldn't consider alfalfa as a good choice for those horses. So I mentioned earlier that I did want to touch just really briefly on using alfalfa in a pasture system. So this was some work that was done when I was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. We did a lot of equine grazing work when I was a graduate student there. And we did several different studies evaluating alfalfa and other legumes as a part of an equine pasture. And basically for all of these different studies, we were looking at things like yield and forage quality or forage nutritive value, and even horse preferences when they were grazing. One of the studies in particular was looking more at mixtures. So there was different grasses, meadow fescue, orchard grass, and bluegrass, and these were mixed with either alfalfa or white clover, or included as just the grass by itself. So we had different mixtures and different combinations of these different forages. And then there was also another study that was looking at kind of grazing just legumes. Like, are horses able to graze only legumes? How do they compare on different alfalfa varieties compared to red clover or white clover? How do they fare? What do they prefer, etc. So I just really briefly wanted to show a couple of results. These are from the mixture trial, because in reality, most of the time, if we're including alfalfa or a legume for horse pasture, we're probably going to be including it as part of a mixture with grasses. So I decided to focus more on that rather than kind of the straight legume one. But this is a very busy figure, I realize, but it's showing different forage treatments that you see along the bottom. So KB is Kentucky bluegrass, MF meadow fescue, OG orchard grass. And then all of those three grasses in combination with alfalfa is the AL. And then all of those three grasses in combination with white clover is the WC on the far right. So here in the middle are our three treatments that include alfalfa. The different colored bars represent just different years that were part of this project. But you can see we saw some minor differences in forage yield overall, but if we had to look at kind of these middle three or pull alfalfa out, we see that it's usually kind of the among the highest yielding mixtures. So alfalfa can be something that's really productive, produces a lot of tonnage when included, both in a hayfield or in a pasture mix. So adding that kind of legume component in there can contribute to our kind of total forage yield. So something to think about it from a pasture standpoint is adding legumes or adding kind of mixtures into the system can help boost our kind of overall forage yield. We also looked at kind of botanical composition, and this basically means kind of the percent of the different species. So what percent of the area was grasses, what percent of the area was legumes, what percent of the area was other. In this case, it says non-sown. That basically means things that we didn't plant or we didn't intend to be there. So these would be kind of our weedy species. So any weeds that kind of crept in or infiltrated into that system. And the labels here are the same as on the last slide. Here on the far left is the three treatments that you see mixed with the alfalfa, the AL. And what you can kind of pull out from this is when we had alfalfa in the mix, you can see there's a lot less of that white component, that non-sown component. So when we added alfalfa along with some of these grass species, we saw a reduction basically in the amount of weeds that were creeping in. So we know that, weedy species are really opportunistic and they like to kind of fill in the gaps where maybe they see some space in between forages. And by having that alfalfa or even that legume component along with our different grasses, we kind of minimized opportunities for those weeds to kind of creep in and take over. And we saw kind of a lower percentage of weeds overall in that pasture. Again, this one is really busy. I just want to kind of pull out a couple of really quick things. This is looking at the nutritive value from this experiment. You can see a couple of years, 2014 and 2015, for different nutrients. So CP, crude protein, NDF, neutral detergent fiber, kind of that total fiber measure. And then NDFD 48, which is basically the digestibility of that NDF. So kind of looking at the digestibility component. The abbreviations on the left are those same treatments. So the different grasses with alfalfa by themselves or with clover. And here in the middle is where we see kind of our alfalfa ones. And if you compare, for example, especially crude protein, when we add alfalfa in, we see that compared to the lines above it, where we have just grasses, we see that increase in the total kind of protein content in the pasture. So kind of just illustrating that we did see that increase in protein from that legume component added in. If you look at the middle two columns, the NDF, we saw actually fairly similar between grasses and grasses plus alfalfa. And I like to think of this as, this was not a just alfalfa pasture, it was a mixture. So we still have that grass component in there. So maybe not as many differences as we would have expected, but that grass is also contributing to that higher fiber content. And then the digestibility again was also fairly similar or a little bit higher when we added alfalfa or clover into the mix. So we see those legumes adding kind of a little bit to that energy component, adding to that calorie dense component, and kind of bumping up the digestibility of the forage in the pasture. And then the last thing we looked at was horse preference. So, and this one is kind of split out into the effect of just the different grasses or the effect of just the different legumes. So here we have alfalfa or AL line. And if we look at horse preference of alfalfa compared to the grass by itself, which is the GM that's right above that line, we can see that alfalfa was either equal or higher in preference compared to just the grass by itself. Actually, horses really preferred the clover. So the alfalfa gave us a little bit more of the tonnage and the production, but the clover was actually what horses preferred the most. But you can see that compared to our grasses, alfalfa was either equally as preferred or more highly preferred than our grasses. So tying back to that kind of palatability factor for those legumes. So that's just kind of a brief recap of kind of maybe some times when we might want to include legumes, or some reasons, why we might want to include legumes like alfalfa in a pasture system. You could just as easily, swap this out for some of the clover species as well. But things like increased forage yield, a more nutrient dense pasture, increased palatability, more weed suppression, and then, that nitrogen fixation that comes in from the legumes might be advantages to having alfalfa in kind of that pasture system. And then the very final thing that I wanted to mention, just in case people are, purchasing alfalfa hay and they see reduced lignin alfalfa or something like, reduced lignin alfalfa advertised as a hay thing. So this is basically a couple of specific varieties of alfalfa that are being bred to reduce the overall fiber content. So NDF includes, like we said, that total fibrous component, cellulose, hemicellulose plus lignin. If we pull out just the lignin, that's considered the most indigestible component of that fiber. So lignin basically is, pretty much indigestible. And we see this relationship where as our lignin concentration increases, we decrease the digestibility of that forage. So lignin is indigestible, so more lignin you have in there, the lower your fiber digestibility is going to be. So people that are really looking to push alfalfa production have bred alfalfa to have a lower lignin content. So basically to have a greater fiber digestibility. And we wanted to kind of evaluate this and see, does it yield as well? Is it, as good of quality, etc. And also for horses, how does it actually translate to digestibility? So just to briefly summarize, this is basically like my entire PhD in like 2 slides. So you're welcome. The objective basically, like I said, was kind of compare that reduced lignin to other alfalfa varieties. What we ended up seeing was in our studies, as well as some work by others, is we did see, of course, a reduction in lignin. So they did succeed in reducing the total amount of lignin present in those forages. You can see here when you look at a reduced lignin versus a control, we've seen anywhere from like a 9 to 20% decrease in the total lignin concentration in the plant. When we look at the NDF D or NDF fiber digestibility, we see as a result of that reduction in lignin, an increase in the digestible fiber of those forages when tested in the lab. And then the total kind of dry matter digestibility, we saw a small increase in kind of that total dry matter digestibility. So that was when alfalfa samples were tested in the field and how they kind of compared to each other. So shows promise, right? We see a reduction in lignin, we see an increase in digestibility. Well, how does that translate to the actual animal? So we did a big long feeding study where we looked at a whole bunch of different things. Digestibility was one of them, but other components that go along with that as well. And long story short, when we looked at digestibility, so this is comparing for each of these columns, digestibility of different nutrients. So DM, dry matter, kind of overall digestibility, crude protein digestibility, ADF digestibility, and NDF digestibility. Reduced lignin is in the red maroon color, control is in the yellow, and you can see that really the only major difference or significant difference that we saw was in kind of that overall dry matter digestibility. So the reduced lignin alfalfa did have a greater dry matter digestibility when it was fed to horses and measured in that way. So I just wanted to throw that out there in case anybody's seeing reduced lignin alfalfa hay offered on the market, so you know kind of what it is and maybe how that fits in with this whole spectrum of alfalfa forage quality. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Of course, we know there's many misconceptions on feeding alfalfa to horses, although you guys did really well on the true or false. So maybe some of those misconceptions are becoming less of an issue. But we know that forage test is going to allow us an accurate quality assessment. We know that alfalfa can be a really good forage source for some horses. It's a high quality forage that can match a high nutrient demand. It's a palatable forage that we can use to encourage consumption, and it provides additional calcium that we can use to some extent to help buffer a little bit of that gastric acidity. We also know that alfalfa is not suitable for all horses, right? So it can be too high of quality for any of those categories of horses that do not need it. And then lastly, alfalfa can be used in a pasture system as well. I know it's more commonly fed as hay, but it can be incorporated as a forage in a pasture system along with other legumes and lots of different grass options. So a lot to consider with alfalfa. I know I threw a lot at you. Hopefully I didn't overwhelm everybody. But yeah, with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Grev. That was a wonderful presentation. And you have had a lot of questions coming in, some of which Dr. Burk and I have been trying to answer, but I have compiled a few for you, if you don't mind.
Yep.
And the first one I think is kind of one of the bigger cons, I feel like, that comes up with alfalfa, and that tends to be blister beetles. So can you address that? We've seen a lot of blister beetles in areas where they typically haven't been before. How do you manage this, and how do you trust that you're getting your alfalfa from a source without them?
Yeah, that is a really hard one. So yeah, for those who aren't familiar, blister beetles is a type of insect that oftentimes can be found in alfalfa fields. And as that alfalfa hay is being harvested, if those beetles get kind of wrapped up in that hay with the equipment and they end up in the final hay product, they can be toxic to horses, and they can actually be toxic enough to kill a horse. So they're really something to watch out for. So with anyone who's feeding alfalfa hay, I always recommend familiarizing yourself with what blister beetles look like, so you know kind of what to look out for as you're feeding that hay. A few things on the kind of blister beetle life cycle, if you will. I'm not going to go too into depth, but basically we see increasing populations of blister beetles kind of later in the summer, so more as the summer starts to get hotter and drier. And we also see increasing populations of them as that alfalfa starts to flower. So when it starts to flower and when it's later in the summer is when we see kind of a higher prevalence of blister beetle populations happening. So generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, hay that's harvested earlier in the year, so first or maybe even second cutting, depending on when those were taken, oftentimes we don't see as high of a risk for blister beetles. We also usually don't see as much of a risk if the hay was more immature, so it's more of a high quality hay. We have less of those flowers present in that hay, which seems to kind of attract more of the blister beetles. And then the last thing is, when we see blister beetles, they usually come kind of in like a huge spurt or a huge kind of cloud at once. And if a hay producer kind of knows what they're doing and is aware of it and routinely sells hay to horse customers in particular, they can actually kind of avoid that area of the field or harvest that area later, or make a note not to sell that. Like they should, if they're familiar with it, they should be able to, identify those beetles as well and kind of know if they're dealing with that or not. So the good news is they like to kind of travel together, if you will, in a pack. And we usually see kind of a dense swarm of them in a given area. So there's usually a lot of them in one place and then not as many kind of in other places. So if the hay producer and the forage feeder are looking out for those or know what they're looking out for, hopefully we can kind of set those beetles aside. But those are just some really general tips.
Awesome. Great answer. Thank you, Dr. Grev. I might just take one more just to keep us on time, but I got a few questions about the appropriate or the applicability of feeding alfalfa to a horse that either has Cushing's or insulin resistant or something along those lines. And I know you talked a little bit about non-structural carbohydrates, but can you address that sort of feeding for those particular horses and even the senior horses that might be healthy otherwise?
Yeah, so that is a really good question, and one that is near and dear to my heart, because my horse, like I said, is a senior horse, and he also has PPID or Cushing's, so I have dealt with this myself. So I think when it comes to if alfalfa is the right choice for horses that have Cushing's or not, it ties back to not only does that horse have Cushing's or not, but is that horse also suffering from things like metabolic disease or other things. So for my horse, for example, he does have Cushing's, but he is not overweight by any means. And we've measured his insulin levels, and he's actually one of the ones that's not as sensitive to the insulin, or doesn't have kind of those insulin issues to the same extent as maybe an equine metabolic syndrome horse or some of those other cases. So for him, I love alfalfa because it's the perfect fit. It can offer him that higher energy profile. It has the lower non-structural carbohydrates, or theoretically lower on average compared to the cool season grasses, and it still provides that energy dense forage that he needs. On the other end of the spectrum, if you have a horse that has Cushing's, but is also kind of more of that metabolic syndrome, is overweight, is on that end of the spectrum, or is more sensitive to insulin, then alfalfa is a more energy dense forage. So we don't want to be perpetuating the overweight issue. We don't want to be perpetuating that kind of thing by feeding that horse more calories. So for those horses, I would look instead for grass hay that is lower in non-structural carbohydrates, or maybe if you're able to, kind of using other ways to reduce the non-structural carbohydrate component by soaking the hay, other things like that, diluting it out with other hay that has lower non-structural carbohydrates. So it really comes down to, in my mind, not only if they have Cushing's or not, but also if they're struggling with those other kind of metabolic factors along with it. So important to know where your horse falls.
Awesome. That was a great answer. Definitely, as we always say, it depends. So I'm gonna have to cut questions off, but I asked Dr. Grev if you would. There's still a bunch of them in the Q&A, if you don't mind. While Dr. Burk is speaking, maybe just see if you can type in some answers for some of those questions that might have gotten left unanswered. That would be great.
No problem. I'm happy to stick around, and I'll work on that.
Awesome. So you can go ahead and take your screen share off and your camera off, and I'll ask Dr. Burk to come on and start to share her slides. Dr. Burk is a very good friend and colleague of mine. She is a professor and the coordinator of the Equine Studies program at the Department of Animal and Avian Sciences at the University of Maryland. Dr. Burk and I did meet quite a while ago. We won't say how long, but we were both graduate students together at Virginia Tech. We were on a wonderful thoroughbred breeding farm, and we were both studying equine nutrition together. So we've done a lot of these programs together, and I feel like we work well. But Dr. Burk has been at the University of Maryland for 22 years. She teaches several horse-related classes, conducts applied research, on both nutrition and pasture management. The main aims of Dr. Burke's extension program are to reduce equine obesity and to increase the best management practices on horse farms to enhance environmental stewardship. Dr. Burke is the governor-appointed member of the Maryland Horse Industry Board and a past chairman of the National Association of Equine Affiliated Academics. Her teaching and outreach efforts have been recognized by many awards, including Outstanding Educator at the Equine Science Society. So with that being said, Dr. Burke, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. I am such a lucky lady to get to work with Dr. Grev and Dr. Williams, and it's a pleasure to be able to come here this evening and talk to all of you who have tuned in live, and also all of you who have tuned in on YouTube or some other lovely social media platform. You know, I spend a lot of my time talking about how horse owners can create productive pastures to feed their horses, but in reality, we have a lot of horses that don't need all of that for their diet. So tonight, I'm going to spend time talking to you about weight control strategies for horses on pasture, and also those are on forage diets. And let's get started here. So the main objectives are, I hope at the end of this talk, you're able to identify what an overconditioned horse is. Also, I want you to be able to understand some of the negative implications of being or managing your horse so that it's in an overconditioned state. And then what I'm really going to focus more on is giving you tips for, strategies for weight control, because there's so many things you can do, but not everything's going to work for your horse or your housing environment or even, your pocketbook. So, take some of these tips and hopefully they work for you. Equine obesity is an issue. It's been an issue for a long time, unfortunately, but it's when our horses acquire so much fat that, they may have an impairment to their health or their bodily function. This is kind of a funny little cartoon there, because a horse that gets to be that obese is never going to be jumping that fence. But, overweight horses do come with negative implications to their health. So it's been documented, depending on the population that's studied, obesity or being overconditioned is somewhere between 30 to 51% of our horse population, which sadly mimics what you see with the human population. And I think there's some links there, but we could talk about that later. And we wanted to know in Maryland, what is our obesity issue? What percentage of our horses are overconditioned? So one of my graduate students at the time, who's now Dr. Aubrey Jaquith, did a survey of licensed stables in Maryland, and we had about 93 horse farm operators write back and tell us what their pony's body condition score was, ponies and horses. And we found that 40% of the population that we surveyed was overconditioned. So we know it's an issue near and dear here that we need to work on, but it's something that we see, I would say nationally, if not globally. So when I talk about body condition, I just want to go through it somewhat quickly. There are so many resources online if you want to read up, but Don Henneke in Texas a long time ago worked with his graduate students to establish a scale that measures the fatness of a horse, the adipose tissue accretion, if you will. And horses acquire fat in different places, one being over the neck, on either sides of the wither, just behind the shoulder, over the ribs, on the loin, and on either side of the tailhead. And those are the major sites that we're going to focus on. They do acquire fat in other places, but those are the ones that Dr. Henneke found were the most significant. And then through his observations, he made this scale of 1 being poor or extremely emaciated, upwards of 9 are extremely fat. And what we try to do is feed horses so that they accrue fat to some extent. So we want them to somewhere between a 4 and a 6 in the body condition score. But, there are other horses that are neglected and thin, the rescue type horses, they're in the 1, 2, and 3 range. So, walking skeletons, basically, upwards of the 7, 8, and 9s, which we're going to talk about tonight. So I want to first show you kind of the ideal horse or what's good, and then we'll go on to what's not so good. But most of our competitive athletes, our endurance horses, they tend to be a little lighter. So having a body condition score of 4 isn't that bad. It's on the lower end, but we recognize that some horses should not be carrying a lot of weight. So this horse has neck, wither, shoulder, not obviously thin. You can see his ribs a little bit. Fat can be felt alongside the tailhead, but not fat, not a lot of fat is accruing on that horse. So we get into a body condition score of 5, which, most horses could be at a body condition score of 5. That's a healthy amount of fat accretion on the body. So the neck and shoulder blend smoothly with the body. I mean, if you look at this horse, he's just smooth all the way around. So he's got a little bit of fat. It's kind of hard to see with his mane. You would be able to press and feel a little bit of fat there on the withers. You can see a little bit of fat accretion there. And I should stress, by the way, we do need to palpate the horse and feel the horse's fat accretion to really get a good idea of the body condition score. So it's kind of hard to tell you and teach you off pictures. The loin there is probably going to be flat with a little bit of fat accretion and kind of a flat shape on either side of the tailhead. And then we get up to the body condition score 6. And for me, the 6 is really when fat is beginning to be stored in a way that you can start to see it. So there's a little bit of fat mound here. There's more fat. You can feel a little bit more of a fat buildup on either side of the withers. They may have more fat behind their shoulder now. There may be a slight crease, meaning the fat has built up ever so slightly, so you can't see their backbone. And then there's fat around the tailhead just starting to accrue. So instead of being flat like a 5, you start to see a little mound there building. And then we have goals. So our working horse, they can be a 4 if you have a race horse or a barrel racer, an Arabian endurance horse, whatever. You don't want them to be carrying hundreds of extra pounds in adipose tissue. But some working horses, the show horses, maybe dressage horses, they tend to be a little bit more on the heavier, body condition score of 6 side. So really our goals there are to stay within that. Our growing horses, typically we try to feed right to a body condition score of 5. We don't want them too thin or too fat. And that's mainly related to growth. Maintenance horses, those that aren't doing very much, they could be a 5 or a 6. And then reproducing horses, we try to get them to a 5 or a 6. I particularly like stallions and brood mares entering the breeding season to be a 6 because things happen, they get stressed out. Stallions are working hard during breeding season and they need a little fat to really draw from during that time. Especially for a brood mare who's pregnant or about to start lactation, she needs to have a little bit of fat on her skeleton to really draw from if she needs it. But really we're talking that, that's where we want to be. But with the overconditioned horses, we find ourselves in this situation where we are 7s, 8, and 9s, where our horses are. So a 7 is when we have to start getting kind of concerned because that's the body condition score that seems to be associated with greater risk of metabolic conditions, and we'll talk about that. But here, this horse has fat deposited along the neck, withers, shoulder, ribs can be felt with no noticeable filling, so you can't see the ribs. You're going to push around in there, but it'd be hard to feel them. Probably has a positive crease. This horse doesn't look like he does just yet. But you can kind of see there gets to be a point where the fat kind of swallows up the tailhead and it's starting to grow and really mound up back there. And then we get into our 8. This is a picture of a horse that I captured at a therapeutic riding program where they clearly had excellent nutrition, but he didn't have a lot of work to do. So he accrued way too much fat. He needed to exercise more and get a less quality type of diet. But he's got thickening of the neck here. Gosh, the withers are really mounded. Look at the tailhead back there. It's really the adipose tissue has accrued quite a bit. And then if we get up to our body condition score of 9, that's really the red zone. I mean, both body condition score of 8 and 9 are extremely, dangerous as far as causing metabolic problems and also laminitis and things like that. But this poor guy has what we call regional adiposity. And when he has that crusty neck that you see there, really mounds of fat, that's a serious, serious condition. I will say, though, that every horse is an individual, and you might have a BCS of 7 type horse who's got metabolic problems, and you might have a BCS of 8 horse who's as healthy as can be. So you have to work with your veterinarian when you have horses in this body condition score range, because this is not ideal, just to make sure we can get the weight off and get them in a healthier range so you don't run the risk of having them have problems. I wanted to mention another scoring system that a colleague of mine from Virginia Tech, Rebecca Carter, did in 2009. She worked with some ponies and she noticed that when horses had crustier necks, more on the score here, 4 down here and 5, they were at a higher risk for laminitis. So the Henneke body condition score is subjective, and it does incorporate neck accretion for neck fat accretion. But this also can be paired with it to get a good idea. Is your horse at risk? So I would say if your horse is a 7 or above, or a crusty neck score of 4 or 5, your horse is at risk for some problems. So we'll talk about that in just a second. I won't spend too much time. I think Dr. Shannon Pratt Phillips already spoke about that last week. But why are our horses overweight? And that's the $1 million question. And I think a lot of it is because we kill them with kindness. All of you who are listening in tonight are, trying to do better by your horse and learn about nutrition and improve the quality of their diet. But I think we overfeed horses pasture. We overfeed them hay, even though that's forage, it can be fattening. And we also love to give them concentrate or commercial concentrates that have high carbohydrates in them. Treats, too many apples, too many carrots, that sort of thing. So unfortunately, we do tend to overfeed our horses. I think there's some bias, like if you go into certain show rings, there are judges who prefer a horse that's a little fleshier than a thinner horse. And so you have to feed your horse up to a certain body condition score. I will share that at the University of Maryland, we have 6 campus horses. And in the past, I've tried to keep them at a body condition score between a 5 and a 6. And I was told I was starving them. And I realized that personal preference for people who come to campus, they want a fleshier horse. So we do tend to hit the body condition score of 6 now. Although I don't like having them have that much extra weight on their frame if they don't have to. But there's some biases out there. I also think lack of exercise. I mean, horses are expensive and we have to have, a couple jobs to even afford them. So you may not have the time to ride the horse that you work so hard to afford. So that's a problem. We also have loss of land in our area, like Maryland. We don't have a lot of, 30-acre fields. We have 2-acre pastures, and there's just a lot less land for them to run around and play in. And then genetic predisposition, our easy keepers, like our ponies, our Morgans, there's a list of breed there. These are the horses that just tend to stay, fatter with less feed. So we always say they stay fat on a puff of air. But it is true that certain breeds are just predisposed to being overweight. They just, don't require the calories like our thoroughbreds do. And then we've had colleagues like Kibby Triber propose that there's even a thrifty gene, that some ponies are just thrifty. They have good feed efficiency. They don't need all these high calorie sort of pastures that we put them on. They don't need concentrates. They're pretty rugged, basically, on a high fiber, low energy type diet. So there's lots of reasons, but you just have to take it. Well, you just have to really realize that there are negative consequences to horses being overweight. So it can affect their health and performance. Some of the things that might happen if a horse is overweight, and this is more of a body condition score, 7, 8, or 9, they run the increased risk of laminitis. Laminitis is a painful hoof condition that involves inflammation of the lamina between the coffin bone and the hoof wall that can lead, to pretty dire circumstances with horses. It's just extremely painful and costly to treat. Equine metabolic syndrome is when they have a body condition score of 7 or higher, laminitis, and insulin resistance, which I think we've talked about earlier tonight. And then poor athletic performance. You can imagine yourself if you were trying to run or play a sport and you're carrying 150, 200 extra pounds. It's just, well, for us that would be a lot. I'm thinking horse weight, sorry. But a horse that's trying to run a race with 150 extra pounds is a lot. So you can have decreased performance that way. That extra weight can cause some degenerative joint situations. And we are very focused on joint health in the horse industry. We spend a lot of money on joint supplements, so we don't want to create problems with extra weight on the frames of these horses. When they're overweight, it's really hard to dissipate heat. So in some of the hotter, humid climates, you have overweight horses. It's a real struggle for them to sweat and keep their temperature regulated. Developmental orthopedic disease in young growing horses is a big concern. It's a huge economic loss to have those. So we don't want to create problems by having overweight foals that grow too quickly and have, flexural deformities and crooked legs and that kind of thing. And then the study that my student did found that it was a real cost to these horse farm managers to manage these obese horses. It costs money in grazing muzzles. It costs money to manage the dry lots that we put them in. And it was about $434, I think, a person is what we estimated. So if you extrapolate how much that study showed us people pay per overweight horse, and extrapolate that out to the whole US industry, it's a lot of money that we're spending to manage these overweight horses. So we need to prevent this instead of trying to manage it and treat it. So the best thing I can tell you, start with a weight loss plan. Identify that your horse is overweight, accept it. Just, sometimes it's hard to accept. And then talk to your vet about a weight loss plan. Your veterinarian is really part of the team. They're going to help monitor your horse's medical conditions or their weight loss. You don't want to do it alone because you can do it too quickly and cause your horse to lose weight too fast, or you can just not do it well and your horse doesn't lose weight at all. So talk to them, come up with a plan, determine with your vet the ideal body weight for your horse and body condition score. Really, there's no ideal body weight for a horse. I think it's easier to kind of base your weight loss plan on the body condition score. But having like a weight tape like you see here in this picture is really important for estimating body weight of your horse so you can see relative trends as the months pass. Having a scale would be great, but they're expensive. So if you don't have a scale, grab a weight tape. And then be ready to monitor it monthly. It's too hard to worry about if your horse lost weight this week or not. It needs to take place over months. So if you're really into it and you want to, estimate weight loss every 2 weeks, okay, but monthly would be better because that's when you're going to see the biggest changes. So here's some tips, and these are just tips that I find that are helpful. If you want your horse to lose 1 body condition score or 2 body condition score, in my experience, a body condition score is about 75 pounds for an average horse. That's not everybody's experience because some people have miniature horses, some people have ponies, some people have draft horses. But for the average size, like stock horse that you see in this picture, that would work. So 1 loss of a body condition score takes about 1 month, maybe 2 months if you're going to go slow, which is great. We don't want to do it fast. If a current body condition score is 8 and you want to get down to 6, you got to have your horse lose about 75 pounds times 2, so about 150 pounds. And just assume it's going to take a while. We don't want to do it too quickly. They're going to resent you if you do it too quickly. But you want to do it slowly to be healthy. So talk to your vet about your goals, and then your vet's going to need to talk to you about how you manage your horse. So how much pasture turnout does the horse have? What's the quality of the pasture? I'm not so sure this miniature horse, cute as she is, needs to be out on this lush pasture. So talk to your vet about that. What feed and supplements is your horse getting? Is it on pasture plus hay? Does it get concentrate? Does it get a forage balancer? How much stall time versus turnout versus exercise are they getting? Are they in the stall 22 hours a day and out for a little bit? Are they turned out 24/7? So you want to talk to your veterinarian about that. And who are they turned out with? And what how do you feed your horses as a group? Because your horse might be a bully and might be eating all the other horses' grain and pushing them out from their tubs. So those are some things you need to talk about with your veterinarian. So I'm going to give you some strategies that you can talk to your veterinarian about. Some of these will work for you. Some of them won't work in your situation or won't work for your horse, and that's fine. I just thought I'd give you my top 10 tips. So most of these tips are going to revolve around 3 things. Reducing calories or intake of the diet, which is primarily most of the tips. Increasing exercise, hard to do, but we'll give you some strategies. And then I don't spend much time on administering medications or supplements because, to be honest with you, there hasn't been a lot of research that shows that medications and supplements really are that effective. So the first tip here is we need to reduce the overall amount of the diet. And that's because most horses that are overconditioned or overweight or even obese, they're eating too much. The average horse consumes about 2% of their body weight in forage and possibly concentrate during the day. But I've seen through my research at Virginia Tech when I was there for my master's that we had thoroughbreds that would consume upwards of 3% of their body weight. And there's some other research that shows that ponies if left to their own accord, will eat up to 5% of their body weight. That is way too much. So we need to rein that in. So what most veterinarians say is, so, you know, you're going to take a weight on your horse, and let's say this horse is, I don't know, just for math purposes, 1,000 pounds. And he would normally, he looks like he eats about 3% of his body weight. But for a weight loss diet, our goal in the beginning is going to be 1.5% of their body weight. So you take 1.5% of whatever your horse is and start there. We would like to continue doing that for several months, and hopefully we'd see some sort of progress. If not, talk to your veterinarian about lowering that further. So what a recommendation might be is 1.3% of the body weight to kind of hopefully get that horse to start losing weight. In severe cases, I've heard of people recommending 1%, but that gets a little tricky because now they're not eating enough fiber. They can run the risk of colic. I think that increases the risk of gastric ulcers too, because there's not much, you know, fiber in the gut buffering the gastric mucosa there. So be careful. I would not get down that low, but you can talk to your vet about it. So here's another, you know, this horse's example. So currently he's about 1250, body condition score of 8. That means he eats about 31 pounds of forage, hay, pasture. Here he doesn't have pasture, but usually he's turned out on pasture. So let's say our goal with our veterinarian is we're going to try to get him to 1,100 pounds, body condition score 6. So what that means is if we take 1,250, which is where he is now, times 1.5% of his body weight, that's 19 pounds of usually forage. Well, that's a 38% reduction. So keep that in mind, that you're trying to reduce the feed, and you may not want to do it that fast. You may want to gradually get down to 1.5% to give your horse some time to adjust to that reduced diet. But that's where we want to be to start, you know, having success with weight loss. That's one strategy. Another thing that you have to do is reduce the calories in the diet. If you're feeding a really calorie-rich diet, like look at that pasture down there, your horse is out on pasture, and then you think, you know, everyone else in the field gets grain, so my horse should get some grain. And grain is another word for concentrate, which is a concentrated form of energy, protein, vitamins, and minerals. Not all horses need that. I think so many of us grew up thinking that. But we gotta limit concentrate, if not wipe it out of the diet. Limit really lush pasture. Not many horses require lush pasture to maintain their weight. So we're gonna do that. And I wanted to give you some numbers, because what you'll hear throughout this presentation is, you know, to focus on non-structural carbohydrates. Those are the sugar and starches in the diets, and we want to keep those low to reduce weight gain. So I pulled out some I pulled out some feeds from Equine. It's a testing laboratory that puts these values up online of what they find for sugar and starch. And if you add sugar and starch together, you get the non-structural carbohydrate level. So you can see that some of these are pretty low, Bermuda grass hay, some legume hays, but there's quite a range. And if you feed straight oats, or even these commercial concentrates that were developed for race horses or performance horses, you can get quite high levels of non-structural carbohydrates. So as we go through, I'm going to talk about keeping non-structural carbohydrates low by not feeding concentrates. So what you were trying to do, and you know, I can answer this in the questions, but most veterinarians and researchers recommend a low NSC diet for overweight horses, trying to keep it less than 10 to 12% NSC. So that in this range would be, you know, like Triple Crown Senior. I don't get paid by them. It's just a product I'm familiar with in our area. Beet pulp, legume hay, most grass hays are okay, Bermuda grass hay. And then I'll give you strategies for lowering NSC levels in the diets later. But I would stay away from oats or rice bran or Triple Crown Complete. You know, there are products out there that are pretty high in NSC. So keep that in mind as we go through. So my recommendation is take concentrate out of the diet unless your horse really needs it, but over-conditioned horses, you know, pretty much don't. Also consider those bags of carrots you're getting at the grocery store. They also have non-structural carbohydrates and excess calories in them. So 1 carrot a day, let's try to, you know, rein it in. And we really need to focus on forage now, which sad is when I go to talk to horse farm operators and I go, what do you feed? They always tell me the concentrate first. But that's not even the majority of the diet. I need to know what the majority of the diet is, which is the forage. Okay, so looking at the forage, you have some options for these overweight horses, and typically you want to stay on the lower quality end of the hay or even the pasture. So feeding mature hays, and what I mean by mature is I have a little chart here. So when grasses grow, this looks like orchard grass in this depiction. When it's really vegetative as it's growing to be made for hay or cut for hay, it's pretty high in digestible energy, vitamins, and minerals. But as it gets to this stage, which is mature, where it has a seed head, where it's about to reproduce, it gets stemmier, less leaf, and it lowers in quality. And for horses that are overweight, feeding a more mature hay, like a hay down here, even though this is green and has some leaf, it actually has full seed heads of Timothy, which means it's mature. That hay is going to have a lower energy, lower protein, lower vitamin and mineral, and be better suited for a horse that's overweight compared to something that's leafy, no seed heads, that kind of thing. So, choose a more mature hay for your horses. Totally avoid mixes with legumes like alfalfa. Like we just heard from Dr. Grev, I would not feed an, orchard grass alfalfa mix to an overweight horse. Just take the legume or the alfalfa out. It's just too high in quality. And then consider that the lower you go in quality, let's say your hay is yellow, stemmy, coarse even, full seed head, that's pretty low quality, but maybe that's all you could get for your horse. Then you got to consider supplementing the vitamins and minerals and the protein in that diet to make sure your horse gets those really important nutrients, but very low energy in the hay. So that's where forage balancers and supplements come in. So we're going to talk about that. So my tip would be lose the concentrate of the grain altogether. Have your horse out on a pasture if you need to, or even feed hay. We'll talk about that too. But feed these balancer products. So a balancer is lower in energy, lower in non-structural carbohydrates, but it has higher protein, vitamins, and minerals, and it complements what your horse is getting in the forage. This is a group of miniature horses that we had on a grazing muzzle study. And for them, because I have access to labs and I can test my forage, I knew that I needed very specific nutrients like copper and zinc and some amino acids to balance out that pasture. So all we fed to those minis was a tiny handful of this particular vitamin and mineral supplement. They didn't even get a balancer. But if you can, get rid of the concentrate, feed the balancers. Balancers are nice in that you only need to feed your horse, depending on their size, about 1/2 pound to 1.5 pounds a day. I would say most horses get 1 pound. So if you bring your horses in and you feed them twice a day, they get 1/2 pound in the morning and 1/2 pound in the afternoon, and they learn to accept it. Trust me. At first they're like, is this it? And you're like, yeah, sorry. No more 4 or 5 pounds of concentrate anymore. But they do come running over the hill for their balancer, I promise you. And then again, for the little guys, these minis really don't need very much. So consider just a vitamin and mineral supplement. That particular one also had amino acids in it, so it was fine. But the balancers are actually, I feed our brood mares balancer with really good quality pasture for the first 5 months of gestation. I feed our lesson horses on campus balancer. Those are the easy keepers. But they get about 1 pound or 1.5 pounds of balancer a day. They don't get any concentrate, and they look amazing, but they, we match the hay for what they need. Another strategy is trying to reduce the amount of hay, but make it stretch and last longer. So if you can slow down their consumption of the little bits of hay that you do give them, that is ideal. So I love these new concepts, these slow feeder, here's a slow feeder contraption that somebody made out in the paddock. We have slow feeder, kind of nets here and nets within our round bale feeders. That is fantastic because now they have to work for their food. Their mouths are busy throughout the day. And let's take a miniature horse because I've had the pleasure of feeding them. They may only need 2 flakes a day to meet their requirements, like their energy requirements. That goes really quickly. So if you can put it into a hay net that has very small holes, and they have to work for that hay, it stretches out that hay that they have to work to eat during the day. So I'm a big fan of slow feed hay nets or slow feeders. The other thing is it increases their chewing, which increases their saliva production, which increases the ability of the saliva to buffer the acids in the gut. And that's going to help reduce the risk of gastric ulcers. So I'm a big proponent of slow feed hay nets and feeders and that sort of thing. Okay, the next tip is feed hay that's low in NSC. If you can, talk to your hay dealer about getting hay that's been tested, but if they won't test it for you, which most don't, you might have to have your hay tested. So you have hays like grass hays typically are pretty low in NSC in the 10 to 12% or lower range. But you really need to test where you're getting your hay from to see. It varies so much. Warm season grass hays, if you're in that area of the country like Bermuda grass or teff hay, those tend to be much lower in NSC. But send it to a lab to be sure. We use Equa Analytical. There are other labs in Maryland that we've used. Cumberland Valley is one. But just to see if your horse is really carb sensitive and is running the risk of laminitis on a near daily basis, then test your hay. Make sure it's lower in NSC. Oops. The other thing you can do, if you just get hay from a certain source and that's where you can get it, and that's what you can afford, and it might be 15% NSC, one way to reduce the NSC content of the hay that you get is to soak it. And there's been some studies done, actually. Dr. Grev has worked with her major professor at the time at Minnesota, Dr. Krishna Martinson, done several studies on this. So you can look up Dr. Martinson and all of her resources. They're wonderful. But one of the things you can do is take a clean muck tub, not one that's been used, put your hay in a hay net and put some water in the muck tub, immerse your hay in the hay net in there, leave it 30, 60 minutes, pull it out, hang it up, let it drip and drab and dry out a little bit, and then you can feed your horse. What you've done is soak the hay in the water, and our non-structural carbohydrates are water soluble. So that means they have now leached out into the water. So you have sugar water left in your muck tub. So don't feed it to anybody, just dump it out. But what you can do is you can reduce NSC levels in your hay by like 30%. So it's a really effective way to reduce your NSC levels if you're concerned about a horse eating too much sugar and starch. The other thing is pasture. I love horses to be on pasture. For me, it's great to see them run and play and be with their friends. But when pasture is lush and it's excessive in calories, it's just not going to be the right place for them to be. So if you can reduce pasture turnout time, some people do that approach. Maybe they have 10 hours out overnight, 14 hours in a stall during the day. That works for a lot of, boarding stables. They like to do that. We have seen research now that talks about carbohydrate levels increasing throughout the day. Dr. Williams and I have done some work on that as well at her Rutgers farm. And yes, carbohydrate levels increase throughout the day. So if you're worried about your horse consuming too many carbohydrates, put them out late at night, pull them off your pasture early in the morning, and let's hope that they're okay. It's no guarantee, but that's what the research is showing these days. The problem with this whole thinking that if I just put them out 2 hours a day or 5 hours a day, 10 hours a day, is they know that. And now we're finding research coming out of like Annette Lungland's lab, even NC State has had some research. If you put a horse out, like let's keep him in a stall, give him some hay, and then we'll go, okay, we're gonna put you out for 3 hours today. They will act like lawnmowers and eat that pasture so quickly that they can consume 1% of their body weight within several hours of pasture turnout. Other studies have found that upwards of 40% of their digestible energy requirements are consumed in 3 hours. So you can't trust them, is what I'm trying to say. They will eat so fast. So that may not be the best strategy for you. What some people do prefer is putting their horse in a dry lot and controlling the diet. So pasture, if you look out here on the right side, it's an uncontrolled diet source. It's got all kinds of calories. They eat and eat and eat till they, pretty much don't stop. At least some of our horses. But if you put them into a dry lot, it has some green grass, some weeds they can nibble on. Now you're going to control the hay intake, so you control how much they consume. So that seems to be helpful for a lot of people. There are drawbacks to it, though. Dry lots are smaller, it reduces their voluntary exercise. That horse out on pasture will likely walk a lot more in voluntary exercise than the horse that's in a dry lot. There is increased cost to a dry lot. They chew on the fencing, you got to replace that. There's erosion issues with dry lots where the rain hits the soil, it's bare, and you have erosion. And then weed control. Weeds are always a problem, no matter where you are. But in a dry lot where the horse kind of turns over the turns over the soil, and the weeds in the soil then are exposed to the sun and they grow and they do well, but some of those are toxic. So you can't assume that all the weeds in a dry lot aren't going to be a problem for your horse, because they will eat toxic weeds if that's all they have. So be careful with dry lots. But I think what a lot of people try to go to first is the grazing muzzles. And I understand why, because you can keep a horse out on pasture, but limit their intake. So these grazing muzzles are these nylon, sometimes plastic, ways that, a nylon contraption that at the very bottom has a 1-inch hole. And they really have to work hard to get the grass up through that hole and then shear off the forage. So it slows them down. So there's been a lot of research that shows that muzzles can reduce feed intake up to 30 to 80%, 86% in horses and 75 to 80% in ponies. That's a lot. Let's just put it that way. But then you have issues of how long do I leave him on for? My pony doesn't like it, he scratches it off. This horse is probably going to like it more grazing these shorter pastures than it's hard to see, but that longer pasture in the background. So that's an issue. So I can tell you, grass length 4 inches or less is preferred by the horses from what I can tell. And herd dynamics change too. They can't bite, mean horses that are bullying them when they have a muzzle on. So we are a little bit concerned about welfare and how they interact with their herd mates. And then some become really stressed out, visibly so that you put a grazing muzzle on and they just shut down and sit still and they won't even move. And I've seen that with our mini horses in our study. Another kind of issue with this is, which one do I pick? And it depends on your horse. I've tried so many, and some horses are great at getting out of some, and some are very effective, and some break easily. So it's kind of trial and error, I hate to say. So that is difficult. But I wanted to share some research with you. We had some miniature horses that we had grazing muzzles on for different amounts of time. So we had some grazing muzzles on for no time, so they were unmuzzled, and that is the gray group here. And then we had some miniature horses that had muzzles on for 10 hours a day and then off for the remainder of the day. That's the yellow. And then the red group here is grazing muzzles 24 hours a day. And we wanted to see, well, if we left it on these different times, would they be more stressed with the muzzles on longer? And if we just focus on kind of the overall mean of this particular setup here and look at salivary cortisol levels, which is a decent indicator of stress, it's kind of one of those easy things to measure. We didn't see a difference in the horses that had the muzzles on 0, 10, or 24 hours a day. So we were like, oh, okay, it doesn't seem like our muzzled group was stressed. In fact, it almost looked slower, but it wasn't significant. And then if we look at heart rate variability, that's another indicator of like stress levels for a horse. We actually saw that the red group here, which is the horses that have muzzles on 24 hours a day, had higher heart rate variability, which is oddly a good thing. If I explain it to you, I think you understand. So your heart rate is regulated when you're stressed out, so much so that your heart beats very like rhythmic. So it's like, dung, 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 like you can hear it beating out your chest when you're really stressed out. But when you're relaxed, your heart rate variability is much higher because, it's not as regulated, you're not as stressed out. So for them to have a higher heart rate variability when they had their muzzles on 24 hours was like, what? How is that possible? They're not as stressed out. That doesn't make sense. And then we repeated the study and we found the same thing, which means I think we're on to something with horses having to work for their feed. I think it's something soothing, or it helps them from a welfare standpoint. So I'd like to follow up on that soon. And then increasing voluntary exercise, that's really important. So we need to get them moving. This is actually a picture of a pasture paradise where you create a track, an outside track out of a pasture, and maybe put some logs there and change where their hay is every day. So they have to walk and walk and walk. And I've seen people love that. It's a lot of work, but it does help increase volunteer exercise. Put an annoying buddy, a young horse even, out with them. And they, it's like having a young animal, like a kitten with an older cat, and the kitten drives the older cat crazy. But it's the same thing with horses. The younger horses will get the older horse or the overweight horse to play. There are some dynamic feeding systems that people try to make where doors open at different time and the horse has to move around, the feeder to try to get the hay. Good luck if you can do that. There are some research labs that are trying those out. That's the pasture paradise there in the picture that some people have tried. Exercise though, like if you can get your horse to exercise 3 to 4 times a week for 30 to 45 minutes, that's ideal. So do it gradually. We don't want to go from 0 to 100 too fast and, you know, exercise them too hard too fast. But you could go on long trail rides. You could lunge them. You could, God forbid, ride your horse if you can do it. I know some horses have issues. And then there are some ways you can, you know, take your horse and put them on exercisers if that is a resource that your facility has. Not many people do, and even swimming. So just to give you some ideas. The other thing that's really, really popular is if your horse can be ridden and it's a great horse, consider leasing it to someone. There are so many people that half lease or full lease and can enjoy your horse when you're not able to and get the exercising on that horse. So that's very popular. And then lastly, medications and supplements. I wish there was a medication or some sort of fancy supplement that would fix all of our problems and create weight loss in the horses, but there just isn't. There's certainly been research on different weight loss medications like levothyroxine sodium or Thyro-L has been one that Dr. Nick Frank has tried in healthy animals and shown that it will induce weight loss in healthy animals, but it's not something that has worked effectively in overweight horses. And then there's different supplements, different things get thrown around, but unfortunately there's just no one supplement that has been shown to reduce weight. So medications and supplements is really not the way to go at this point. I wanted to just show you some more data from a study that Dr. Bakewith did, where she found that the percent of overconditioned equine managed with tools. And so the black group here are the number of overweight ponies. They seem to be managed more with dry lots than our red group, which are the horses. Ponies seem to have more grazing muzzles applied than our horse group did, and also medications not used very much. But interestingly, when we surveyed people about their overweight horses and ponies, they were less concerned about the ponies, but the ponies were more managed because ponies tend to have a higher risk of laminitis. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then of the owners that used dry lots, most felt that they required more maintenance and that they required more time to use a dry lot. So that led us actually to try, and this is the last thing I want to talk to you about. We're going to try to develop a diet horse pasture. So we tested 7 different cool and warm season turf grasses that you would find on a golf course or a park or a soccer field. And we were like, okay, let's try these really rugged turf grasses that are lower in NSC, and let's see if it won't, increase weight gain in our horses. So I can just tell you, we tried all these different turf grasses. Here up top is our wear tolerance studies where we drove this traffic simulator over them. On the bottom there, we did palatability trials, and no one cultivar that we found was perfect. We had zoysia grass, was lovely, but it didn't even grow in Virginia in our trials. Or, tall fescue turf grasses were wonderful for wear tolerance, but they were too high in NSC. So we're still sort of working on this, but people ask me about it all the time. So I just wanted to at least mention it that no, there's no diet horse pasture yet, but maybe someday. Keep in mind that there are issues related to weight loss, so do it slowly with the advisement of a veterinarian. If you go too fast, you can have hyperlipidemia in a horse. If you don't give them enough to eat, they're going to have empty stomachs, and that can increase the risk of gastric ulcers. Stereotypical behaviors, maybe wood chewing, pacing, walking, that sort of thing might increase in horses that have had feed restricted too fast. So keep that in mind. Work with your vet. And then just to wrap it up, obesity is definitely a serious health and welfare concern. We really need to prevent it instead of try to fix it. Horses that are above a body condition score of 7 are at risk for these metabolic issues like insulin sensitivity, equine metabolic syndrome. Work with your vet. That's key to a successful outcome. And then the strategies. I gave you a lot of strategies tonight. Pick one that you think, 1 or 2 maybe, that'll work for you and your horse and maybe your situation. And then again, intellectuals solve problems, but geniuses prevent them. So please, don't let your horse get to these obese states. Try to prevent it. That's the way to go. All right. Well, if I have time, I know we're kind of right at time, but maybe I can answer one question.
We'll make time. You have some great questions. So thank you so much, Dr. Burk, for your extremely practical talk. I thought it was great. So a couple questions that I think rose to the top for me deal with, and I know you mentioned briefly about giving horses treats. And I know we have a lot of therapeutic riding programs online today, and they say a lot of what they do really does rely on giving treats after rides and stuff for both the human and the horse.
Sure.
So can you comment on what might be a healthier option for treats or something that's more low in calories?
Right. I'm a treat giver myself, so I understand. But there are low NSC treats out there. You might have to try to find them a little bit, but I would say just go for the low sugar treats. They're out there.
And what about, can you comment on different types of hays? And I know Dr. Grev did a great job with focusing on alfalfa and the difference in alfalfa with some of the cool season versus warm season. But what about within the cool season hays, like orchard grass versus timothy? Are there differences? And what about even oat hays? Because I know we haven't talked about some of those hays.
Gosh, yeah, that's actually, oat hays aren't something we feed out, in the Mid-Atlantic region. So I don't have a lot of experience with oat hay, although I think paired with alfalfa, it's a balanced diet from what I understand. Timothy and orchard grass really aren't that different. It's about the maturity. Horses love immature timothy just as much as immature orchard grass, meaning like the leafy stuff. But when you let it grow and grow and grow before you cut it and bale it as hay, and it has seed heads and it's stemmy, they don't like either one of them. Some of them, especially timothy in particular, I've seen horses take a bite, throw it on the ground and urinate on it just to let you know that they didn't appreciate the quality of your hay. So it doesn't really matter about timothy versus orchard grass. It's more about the maturity of the hay when it was cut and leafiness, So just to reiterate, leafy means high quality. That's where most of the nutrients are, the protein, the vitamins, the minerals. Stemmy is where all the fiber is. So the stemmier, the lower the quality, the leafier, the better the quality.
Thank you for that. Definitely. I've seen a couple questions asked about how to manage overweight horses that are group fed in pasture situations with underweight horses. So those that need grain versus those that don't.
Yeah, I think in an ideal world, you would keep them separate, but I recognize that friendships form and it's really hard to do. What we've actually switched to now is feeding with slow feed hay nuts, even out in the paddocks, which I find shocking, because our horses prefer to be busy. They just seem happier. They're not wood chewing as much. Keep in mind, our horses are right in the middle of campus. So I'm talking more about campus. But I would say you have to have, like in some stables, what I've seen is they have smaller enclosures within the paddock. They bring the skinnier horses into those smaller, little, fenced off areas. And those horses eat their concentrate while the other horses, can't get to it. So you can't expect to feed thin horses and overweight horses at the same time and not have the overweight horses usually consume the thin horses' feed. It's a management thing where you have to get those thin horses their feed. I mean, truthfully, thin horses should be together and fed more high quality hay, and the overweight horses should be separated and fed less quality, lower amounts of hay if you can.
Just one more follow-up, because a lot of people actually want to know what kind of low-calorie treats would you recommend? I know you say low sugar. Do you have a favorite?
I don't. I'm so sorry. I'm very fortunate that I don't have any obese horses that had to go to the low-carb treats. I'm so sorry. But I do know a lot of people who have horses with Cushing that we talked about with Dr. Grev, or insulin resistant, or have some sort of metabolic issue, and they always tell me, don't feed my horse a high carbohydrate or high sugar treat. So I'm very aware that they're out there, but I don't have a personal preference. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I think I can comment. I know there's a lot of companies, and we're not company partial at all. We try not to be biased, but a lot of companies, if they do have sugar-free or low sugar treats, will advertise that. So I would say if you're looking online for treats, you could even probably just Google no sugar or low sugar horse treats, and you'll probably see a lot of them out there. So,
yeah.
But yeah, great job, Dr. Burk. I know there's a lot we actually didn't get to, so I apologize for that. But just for the sake of time, and I know a lot of people are starting to log off, but before you do, we picked a few names for the prize, and I want to do one thing quick before I actually call those names, and one of those is just draw your attention to the chat, because Kyle has posted in there the link to our little Qualtrics survey. So even if you sent and did this survey last week or the week before that, we really want you to do it again for two reasons. One, we want to know how you liked the speakers and the topics today versus the other days. If you already filled out all your suggestions for next year, you don't have to do it again, but at least go in there and fill out the survey for, how you like the talks and things like that. So we really would appreciate it. So go ahead and look in the chat. He has the link. It'll take like 3 minutes. I promise it's not a very long survey. The next thing I want to do briefly is just show some closing remarks slides from the Equine Science Center. So I'm going to do a really quick screen share, and then I will read the name for the prize winner. So I would like to thank all of our Equine Science Center partners. We do have some that have hung with us over the years, like BI, UMH Properties, Farm Bureau, and our Department of Agriculture. We are done with all of our webinars. I will remind everybody, and I know a lot of you have asked, where can we hear them? Have they been recorded? Well, yes, all of the 3 webinars have been recorded. We are waiting until next month. We're going to kind of let everything settle. And then next month, you will get an email showing and stating that all of our webinars have been posted to the YouTube page of our Equine Science Center website. So you'll be able to go back and refer to these and share these with others that might not have been able to make it. If you are in New Jersey, we would love for you to join us at our Equine Industry Summit. That is on March 16th. It is live, face-to-face on the Rutgers University campus. It is a free program. We're going to talk a lot about issues within the New Jersey equine industry. We also have Rutgers Giving Day, which is actually a week, the week after that in March. We have our Junior Breeder Livestock Symposium, and you don't just have to be a junior. On March 25th, we're doing a big day all on horse anatomy. So please consider joining us for that, as well as our Rutgers Ag Field Day, or Ag Field Day at Rutgers Day, and that is April 29th. So if you're in New Jersey, a lot of face-to-face programs coming up. So with that being said, thank you so much for joining us. And I would ask that Katie Blake, if Katie Blake is still online, please go ahead and write in the chat that you are here. You are our prize winner. I will send your email to Kelly Payne, and Kelly Payne will, later this week, will reach out to you and ask you what prize you will like. And that was very quick. Kelly Blake has already said, yay, I'm here. So let's congratulate her. She is our final prize winner of the night. And we'll get a nice gift basket or prizes from Triple Crown, and they will contact you with your choice of prizes. So thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate Kyle's help in making this whole webinar series possible. I appreciate all of my speakers. Thank you so very much for your time and effort. And thank you again all. Please remember, go ahead and fill out the Qualtrics survey for me. We really appreciate all of your time. So thank you again, and have a good night, everybody.